technique. Gouache is an opaque watercolor. I'm going to do a little painting of this sphere. First, of course, we are going to draw a circle, and then we're going to create a simple shadow map. As you may recall, the angle of the light is going to affect both the form shadow, which is this curve, and the cast shadow, which is this ellipse on the ground. I have other videos on drawing and shading spheres if you need a refresher on that. Now I'm going to erase, I'm going to put a little horizon in here and erase my construction lines. And I need to know where this boundary is, but I don't want that line to interfere with my work later, so I'm going to lighten that. Okay, so I'm going to do a watercolor underpainting. So on this palette I have some raw umber watercolor paint. Put that where you can see it. I'm going to take a little bit of raw umber and I'm going to make a thin wash of raw umber. I'm going to start out with a very diluted paint, and I'm going to just put that on my entire shadow map, wherever the light doesn't reach directly. And I'm not too worried about my edges yet. I'm just blocking things in. Sometimes I do more of the work with values in shading with pencil. That's another way to get your initial values established. In order to create a little bit of a soft boundary here, I'm just going to hatch just the same way I would hatch if I was drawing this. And I'm going to go a little darker, get a little more paint into my mixture for the accent in the cast shadow, darkest part, which is under there. And it's all going to get covered up, so I can hatch, but I'm not worried too much about getting like my best hatching technique. I'm going to add a little bit of a dark accent along this edge where the ball curves away from the reflected light. And since I'm working on a whiteboard, I'm going to just tone down my background a little bit. I'm going to use a much more watery mixture. And I'm just going to hit the background with that. Lots of water on my brush right now. I don't want to put anything on right now that's going to be darker than the final effect that I'm aiming for. So I want my gouache paint to be all slightly darker than the underpainting. And this is going to look pretty splotchy, but remember, gouache is an opaque medium, so it covers a lot of ugly patches. So that's all pretty light. This transition along here is probably also about the same as the value of that back wall, so I'm going to put down a little more along this transition. And then my very lightest mixture is on the ground, everywhere but that cast shadow. Just a little bit of brown curling up these edges. Okay, there's my finished watercolor underpainting. I used raw umber. Because this is going to be a cool gray top coat. So it's basically going to have a little bit of a complementary structure. If you are painting something that has a lot of green in it, you might want to use a redder underpainting. Something that has a lot of red in it, you might want to use a greener underpainting, and so on. But this is basically an orange, and the grays on top are going to be essentially blue, so that gives the painting a complementary structure. So while that's drying, I'm going to mix up my value scale in gouache, and I'm going to put it right on top here so you can see I have black and white here, and I'm going to start, actually I'm going to use a different brush. See how this brush holds a nice point? I don't want to use that for mixing my paint because it's going to be really hard on the bristles. I'd rather use this is a really cheap brush. It's a good mixing brush. It's not holding a point at all. Sometimes I use old worn brushes for this purpose. We don't use a palette knife with gouache because it's too liquidy to use on a palette. I guess you could, and some people probably do, but it's more traditional to use a palette with cups. And I'm going to add a little bit of water to the paint as I go because I want the paint to be liquidy enough to flow off my brush. So just adding little bits of water. So that's kind of a nice middle gray. I'm going to make a darker one over here. Still adding water to the paint as I go. Depending on the area that you're painting, you might need to make a lot more paint than this. This is a very small painting, so I don't need a ton of paint. I'm going to make a lighter one here. And then if I need some more in-between values, I can just mix them on another palette by combining what's on this one. And one more very light one over here. And I think I'm going to need a couple slightly darker ones, so we're going to take that little bit of white that's on my brush and just mix it with some black over here. And maybe one darker one. I'm just going to take what's on my brush and mix it with even more black over here. That'll be my darkest gray. Okay, now I'm going to take my better brush, the one with the point, make sure it's clean. And we always want to start with the backgrounds. Work from the back to the front. And I'm going to estimate the value I need for the floor. Looks really close to this value here. So let's test that. You see how that's darker than the tone that I put on the board already, but it just about matches the gray that's on the floor in the photograph. So I'm going to quickly put down a thin coat of this value. Because it's not that much darker than the brown, it's going to cover easily, and that's one of the main advantages of using an underpainting. You can paint more thinly and still get a fairly opaque effect. I'm not worried about my edges yet. I'm worried about getting right up to this edge. And it's actually better to go a little over your edges if you need to than to leave a space around them. So bear that in mind. You don't ever want to have white boards showing between objects. It's better to have a slight overlap where the object overlaps the background. And that's why we start with painting the backgrounds. So that looks really too dark, but the reason it looks too dark is because it's we don't have any contrast yet, because it's in a world where my shadows are still like this light brown. So in order to get more confident that that's the right value, we're going to go ahead and paint the cast shadow, and that looks about right. I'm just going to block this in thinly over the whole thing, even though it gets a little lighter towards the outside. I keep my paint thin, I can adjust it later. So here's my main cast shadow. Now, what we have left to do here is the transition between these two values, between this one which I used for the ground and this one which I used for the shadow. So what I'm going to do is dip into one of my in-between values, and get where you can see that. And I'm just going to hatch across the edge with this intermediate value. Notice I'm hatching horizontally. Gouache painting is a technique that you're going to use everything you learn about hatching, direction, and drawing. You're going to be able to show that knowledge in gouache painting. And that's what gives gouache its special charm, in my view, is that it allows you to create a blended edge, but to also create it through hatching rather than just blending as you would with oils. Oil painters are, of course, at liberty to show their brush strokes like Van Gogh did, but they're often tempted not to, because the longer you work with oil, the more it obscures the brush marks. Gouache sort of just wants to be in this zone of hatched edges. Now you'll notice I'm showing a little too much blur along the edge at the bottom right. So I'm going to make a correction by cleaning my brush and getting it damp, and then just going with the edge a little bit to tighten that edge back up again. You can do a lot in gouache with just a damp brush. It's not like acrylic, which, as you know, is not redissolvable in water. When you get gouache wet, it redissolves, and you can scumble your edges and blend them a little bit like you see me doing here. Okay, so this area looks pretty good. Just checking my focus here. But what it lacks is the dark in the shadow accent. So I'm going to dip into the darkest mixture that I made and just get a little bit of that on my brush, and I'm going to go in and might even need to add a little bit more black to that. And I'm just going to accentuate this bottom part of the cast shadow, the shadow accent. Okay, now I'm going to finish my background. The wall, as usual, is just a little darker than the floor. So I think I used this for the floor. And let me test that. Yeah, that's my floor color. So I'm going to just make an intermediary between these two. And put that thinly across the entire surface of the wall. Being careful, again, to go right up to my edges. And this would probably be a good time to use a bigger brush, but I don't have one in arm's reach, so I'm just going to keep going with this one. This technique is sometimes useful for sharp edges, to use the heel of the brush. See how I'm pushing the heel of the brush right up against the board and slowly bringing that around to get a nice smooth, crisp edge. You can do the same thing with the tip of the brush, but some people have more control with the heel. And thinly just blocking this in. You can speed up the video through this part if you want. Not much to see here. The thinness of the paint allows a little bit of that brown to show through, which again creates the sort of complementary color structure to the painting. And just checking this for roundness. I'm going to just come in a little closer right here. Okay. So the cast shadow, the form shadow on the ball is going to be mostly the same value as the one we started with for the cast shadow. So I'm going to start with the shadow, with the core of the form shadow, and then I'm going to get a little bit of lighter gray on my brush, and maybe even lighter than that. Start blocking this in. Notice we've got a pretty strong reflected light here, so I'm going to I need this to stand out the right amount from the cast shadow. So I'm going to knock that in like this. And if this needs to go a little lighter, I can just hatch that lightness in. We don't need to get it exactly right the first shot. And we're going to have a similar value on the other side of the core shadow where we're starting to transition towards the light. And then we're into the lighter side of the ball, which is almost all, let's see, yeah, about this value. And the way I check is to push the paint right up to the edge and make sure I've got enough contrast along the edge. It looks about right. Using the heel of the brush again. And you'll notice that all the work I did in the background looked a little bit too dark when I put it on. It's all gonna start to look like the correct value once I've knocked out the last vestige of pure white. As long as there's any pure white in your painting, it's really gonna throw off your ability to correctly perceive your other values. So let's get right in towards that highlight, and like that. You see how much lighter the background looks now? So this is obviously kind of a mess because I haven't done any of my transitions yet. To transition from this core shadow into the reflected light, I'm going to try just using a damp brush. I'm going across my edge again. There's no paint on my brush, but you see how that's just moving that core shadow, distributing it through the surrounding shadow areas. And for this transition, I need to find a middle value that's sort of in between my light and dark, which I think should be this one. So we're going to hatch across that edge now. I need a little more paint. Remember, I'm not just using water now, I'm actually hatching this middle value across the edge. And now I've got some very clumsy transitions from my middle light to my halftones. So I'm going to take a middle value again in between these and hatch across this boundary. Like that. And notice I'm just sort of hatching radially around, like away from the bright light and into the midtone. And I feel like my edge could have a little more contrast up here, so I'm going to just go right back over that with just a half step lighter value. And I'm still trying to achieve a little more of a circular feel here, so try to straighten that out. And I feel like my reflected light could pop just a little more under here. So I don't want to put too much white in there. It's really a dark. Reflected lights are very dark, but I'm going to take this medium gray and test it right in here. Yeah, that just gives me a little bit more of a pop for my reflected light. And it also allows me to transition a little more into the shadow like that. There's also a thing that I neglected. Remember when I first started painting my cast shadow in? I really neglected this extra kind of lightening back here, so I'm going to use that same gray back here and just bring a little more light into the back of this cast shadow. And I can see I went a little too light right there, so I'm going to simply get slightly darker mixture on my brush because I'm losing my edge back here. In fact, I'm starting to think that this was probably fine how it was. So I'm going to bring that right back down to where I had it before. And I realized that I made a really rookie mistake of what I thought this wasn't light enough, when in fact the problem was that this was not dark enough under here. So I'm going to go all the way down to just about pure black. And get the extra bit of dark right under there. Sort of hatching along this edge and pulling that shadow accent a little further to the right. And finally, I need to mix something almost as dark, but not quite, to transition away from those black accents I just put in. So this is a dark gray. I'm going to hatch this way and this way. Gouache is really forgiving. I mean, because it's opaque, because it dries quickly, you can just keep working over areas, and as long as you keep using a lively touch, it's not going to look overworked. You don't want it to look like you really labored over it. You want to just keep using those bold kind of hatching strokes. Okay, so decision. How much further do I want to take this? What I'm bothered by right now is I'm seeing too much of my initial kind of clumsy rendering of this edge here. So I'm going to go over that one more time with a medium gray. You see where that edge is still kind of showing. So I'm going to go over this, make that go away. And then I'm going to keep putting progressively lighter values on my brush and try to get a little more finesse along this shadow edge. I'm using a series of short strokes, and after every series I'm getting a lighter value on my brush. Just getting a little more smoothness into this boundary. And then I'm going to do the same thing up here with my transition from my center light to my main lights. Just going to keep going over these boundaries with in-between values and hatching. Sort of get it so the whole surface of the ball is activated with these little brush strokes. You see it starts to look much rounder after I've done that. And finally, my highlight is reading a little too big. So I'm going to hatch in towards the highlight with something that's almost that bright, but not quite. And I'm going to do a little bit of kind of wet into wet mixing here, just to get that highlight to be a little more diffuse. And I just got a little too much brightness right here, so I'm going to go back over that. And I think I could get away with just a little more brightness on the front of the floor. And what I'm doing here is I'm just leaving a little halo around this shadow, around the cast shadow, which is very similar to what I see in the photograph. I'm just sort of fine-tuning this value and this edge at the same time, creating a little more contrast along here, a little more sharpness. And then to transition towards this slightly darker gray in the back, we're just going to do a combination of horizontal strokes and a few vertical strokes, just fade that out. Okay, the last step is, this is what I warned you about. See how that little bit of white is popping out along this edge? So I'm going to take just a little water on my brush and move the paint around to cover that white. And I'm even going to soften this back edge just a little. And I'm going to call this done. I want you to resist. Once you learn how to handle gouache, you could keep working on this until it was almost photorealistic. You know, if you keep working on it with an increasingly smaller brush. But what I want you to understand is that would really defeat the purpose of a gouache painting. That the activation of the surface with these little brush strokes, it might be a little annoying while you're doing it, but it's going to be a big part of the beauty of the finished product. You know, viewers like to get bowled over by like this realistic effect that's produced at a slight distance, but then when you get up close, you can see the handwork that went into it, and that's something that has always been highly valued and sought after in the art world. And it's not something that you want to try to overcome by creating work that's too highly polished. Okay, that's going to be it for this demonstration. I hope it was somewhat useful. Not the most exciting painting in the world, but so I just put a little distance between myself and the work, and I'm seeing now a slight bulge right here, so I'm going to keep you with me for just a minute while I try to fix that. So I'm going to match this value, and I'm going to use the heel of my brush, and I'm just going to come back over that edge just a little bit. And maybe pull a little. Okay. It's going to take me forever if I keep perfecting it, but I just did what I'm always asking you to do, and basically saw the image from farther away, because now I'm back in OBS, so I'm seeing it shrunk on my screen, and with that vantage point it's much easier to see the little things that would make this painting better. So just bear with me for another minute while I try to fix some of these things. See, I pulled my dark up a little higher on this side. I need a little more of a zone of transition over here, so I'm going to hatch a little higher with a midtone along here. I can see a need for get rid of those brush strokes. I could see a need for just a little more dark in my core shadow. And as long as I keep my brush right where it belongs in the center of the core shadow, I shouldn't need to blend away from it, because I'm basically adding this value to a very similar value. I'm going on top of something that's already very dark. And now I'm just going to take the damp brush again and just incorporate that new shadow accent into the surrounding area a little more. And I'm also going to take a similar dark value and distribute this dark a little more softly into the surrounding cast shadow. And that's like making my reflected light pop a little more nicely. This paint can look a little different when it dries. So like this patch right here that looked okay when it was wet, I need to sort of go over that one more time. And my highlight is also looking pretty splotchy right now, so I'm going to take paint that's almost pure white. And lay it in for my center light. Then I'm going to clean my brush and just hatch away from this one more time into the surrounding lights. And there is a little more light up here than I had. Okay, we're gonna call that a day. Let me zoom in a little so you can. Actually, hang on, I'm gonna bring the camera closer. Yeah, that's a little better look at the final effect. Again, not a masterpiece, but hopefully it'll give you some idea how to handle gouache. Thanks as always for watching, and we'll see you next time.